Here we are at the end of the week, and Nintendo didn't announce a single game for either of their two subscription services. Sony, on the other hand, did announce classic games for PlayStation Plus owners, but their Blood Omen 1 and 2, which we covered earlier this month when we looked at the complete Legacy of Kain franchise. Thankfully, Square Enix has come to the rescue by releasing the much-anticipated Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake, the first of 3 announced updates to 8-bit entries in the Dragon Quest series. With everybody excited to dive into this brand new remake, I wondered what the critics thought of the original games back in the 1980s and 90s. Were these early installments as celebrated as they are today? To answer those questions, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Video Games and Computer Entertainment, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Get your sword and shield ready, adventure seekers, because this is Dragon Warrior Review Crew.
Enix.
If you're a fan of role-playing games, then you've likely heard about Japan's love affair with the Dragon Quest series. For as long as I can remember, magazines were reporting on lines that stretched around the block and how many Japanese gamers considered a new release to be a national holiday. Clearly, Nintendo hoped that this type of fervor would happen when they brought Dragon Quest to the United States, renaming it Dragon Warrior for some reason. Unfortunately, American gamers weren't as receptive to a slow-paced adventure with turn-based gameplay, resulting in a game that underperformed by everybody's expectations. With so many unsold cartridges to move, Nintendo decided to use Dragon Warrior as a way to incentivize NES owners to subscribe to their fledgling magazine, Nintendo Power. Now, having learned their lesson from the 1989 release of Dragon Warrior, Nintendo opted against picking up the sequel, the appropriately named Dragon Warrior 2. This time around, Enix did the heavy lifting, perhaps hoping that many of those free copies that came with Nintendo Power subscriptions turned a few American gamers into RPG lovers. This was, after all, a newer game that implemented a lot of big improvements, including the addition of AI companions and monsters that came at you in packs. While Dragon Warrior 2 wasn't the breakout hit that Enix was hoping for, it did manage to get a lot more coverage in the Western press. Where Nintendo Power was the only magazine to review the first game, giving it a 3.5 out of 5, suddenly there were several publications wanting to weigh in on the sequel. Let's see how that went. When it comes to Electronic Gaming Monthly, they were not impressed. Of course, this was a role-playing game in 1989, so that reaction is pretty much par for the course. Resident Fake Ninja Sushi X didn't even use the full box to review this lengthy RPG. The king has been killed and the evil one's desire to control the world. How many times have we been in this situation? Too many times, I'm afraid. This is the sequel to Dragon Warrior, and I can barely tell the difference. Or care. Ed was a little bit more charitable, explaining why the series hasn't taken off in the States. The main problem Dragon Warrior 2 has is the bad reputation that Dragon Warrior has on NES RPGers. Dragon Warrior 2 is a sequel better than the original, with a very long quest and plenty of challenging situations. Like Ultima, it's only for serious players willing to devote lots of time to a difficult quest. EGM gave Dragon Warrior 2 an average score of 6 out of 10. Unfortunately, Electronic Gaming Monthly was not the outlier, as Video Games and Computer Entertainment was also underwhelmed by the sequel. Giving it a 5 out of 10, CB made a very bad prediction. It's hard to criticize Dragon Warrior 2. On the day the third installment was released in Japan, kids waited in line for hours just to buy a copy, and many of them had that game stolen by muggers as they walked home with it. Although this type of video game hysteria is unheard of in America, you can bet the series will prove to be popular here. But I can't help thinking that when the NES is dead and buried, historians will look at games like Dragon Warrior 2 and scratch their heads, wondering what all the fuss was about. Alright, don't worry RPG fans, there were magazines that actually liked Dragon Warrior 2. Nintendo Power, for example, gave the game a 4 out of 5, which is up from the 3.5 out of 5 that they gave the first game. 4 out of 5 is the exact same score that we got from Johnny Arcade over at GamePro. In order to even find Hargon, you face countless hours of exploration, battles, and even aimless wandering. If you liked Dragon Warrior, you'll enjoy Dragon Warrior 2. It's a good roleplay for beginners and average gamers, but although advanced gamers may enjoy it, they may find it a little tame. And hey, if you haven't tried Dragon Warrior, check it out first. It's fun to do these games in sequence to get the full effect of the saga. You'll be a legend in your own time before you know it. That's right, kids, don't you dare play these games out of order. Also, don't leave now, because we're about to see what the critics thought of Dragon Warrior 3. How's that for a tease?
私の声が聞こえますか？あなたをずっと待っていました。
画面の中にあなたがいる。スーパーファミコンドラゴンクエスト3、そして伝説編、12月6日発売、エニックス。
Hey, remember when Johnny Arcade told you to play the games in sequence? Well, in that case, perhaps you might want to start with Dragon Warrior 3, a prequel that sets up the story found in both Dragon Warrior 1 and 2. Released 2 years after the last installment, this sequel is bigger and more ambitious in almost every way. There's now a class system, a bigger world to explore, and some of the coolest bosses found in any of the Dragon Warrior games up to that point. Once again, Enix published the game in the US, this time spending the money to advertise it with ActRaiser in pretty much every magazine, even the ones that didn't review it, like EGM. Speaking of which, let's see what the critics thought of this third entry in the Dragon Warrior series. With Electronic Gaming Monthly choosing not to review this lengthy RPG, let's go ahead and start with Video Games and Computer Entertainment, which gave this sequel a 4. Nope, that's not a 4 out of 5, but rather a 4 out of 10. Yeah, they didn't like it. They also decided to use the term computer role-playing game in a way that's definitely going to confuse some people. Many gamers shy away from computer role-playing games, believing them to be lengthy and repetitive. Even a true CRPG fan would have to admit that this is generally a reasonable assessment, given the incredible amount of time spent combating creatures. But a well-crafted CRPG balances combat with exploration, interesting characters and locations, rich plots, and good storytelling. Dragon Warrior 3, unfortunately, puts the emphasis on the combat side, while other elements take a back seat. For computer role-playing game fans who aren't deterred by a game with 75% combat and 25% quality role-playing, Dragon Warrior 3 may fill many hours. Everybody else, hang tight until the next Ultima hits the shelves. Sadly, things don't get a whole lot better when we check in with GameZone, who gave Dragon Warrior 3 an average score of 53%. What can I say? It's an RPG. It's another sequel, but an average game. If you're one of the many Dragon Warrior fans out there, though, you should like this new title in the series. While nothing new or exciting is being done using the NES's capabilities, it adds a good amount to the story. But I still can't stand all your guys walking in that long line everywhere. Why not bunch them into one character like other RPGs? Also, is it really necessary to have so many inset menus? Now, when it comes to Nintendo Power, they gave Dragon Warrior 3 a score of 3.6 out of 5, which is better than the first game, but worse than the second. They would later re-review the game and give it a 4 out of 5, but we're only going to count the first review. And then there's GamePro, who remained consistent, giving the RPG the same score as the previous entry, a 4 out of 5. Mysteries, locations, and items abound in Dragon Warrior 3. It's a longer, more complex game than its forerunners, with lots of fresh features such as travel doors, which zap you across time and space to new worlds. The overhead scrolling graphics, sound, and music make the cut, but don't break the mold. All in all, Dragon Warrior 3 does a great Ultima impression, as did the earlier games in the series. Don't hesitate to get your sword polished and your shield buffed, and then help Erdrick and company look for some new blood. Look, this is yet another stark reminder that early role-playing games had a real uphill battle with not only consumers, but also critics. This was an era that rewarded fast-paced gameplay and arcade action, and turn-based combat was just out of step with where most American gamers were at that time. Thankfully, all of that would eventually change, but not for a few more years. Here's a shout out to everybody out there who's enjoying Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake this weekend. I hope you're having a better time than video games and computer entertainment.
Prepare thyself well, Dragon Warrior. Thy most challenging quest ever awaits. Go with speed, but go with patience. Seek out an arsenal, a dragon scale, a torch, and magic herbs. Use wisdom and cunning to choose thy commands, for the Dragon Lord is a fierce rival. Horrible and treacherous minions all guard the Evil One's island castle. Art thou ready, young one?
Yes, King Lord.
And so begins a new epic, Dragon Warrior.
Nintendo, now you're playing with power.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes every time classic games get added to modern consoles. Or sometimes we do it with a remake, like with Dragon Quest III. We have a whole playlist full of episodes just like this one, so give it a binge when you have a few minutes. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's the first role-playing game that you ever played? Was it one of these early Dragon Warrior games? Maybe Final Fantasy? I don't know, maybe something way newer. Let me see your stories in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back next week with more RPG goodness, as well as more reviews and fun. Well, okay, I can't actually promise the fun, but there's definitely that other stuff coming. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,